And if we could admit all, and we'll get started.
And then we're recording too.
Okay, great. Okay, good morning, everyone. We're happy you're here. This is the Instructional Programs Overview. We're sorry about the confusing title in the admin e-news because I received emails from several of you who asked what work you needed to do, but it's actually, our group is called the Instructional Programs Working Group, and we're here to share an overview of the work we've been doing over the past few months in the hopes that it's going to be able to assist you in the process as we all are going to be transitioning to distance learning again. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. So this meeting is being recorded, so if you'd like to share it with your leadership teams or with your teachers, we'll make that available to you. Also, if you'd please type any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll be able to read the response during the presentation, or we could, we'll have time for FAQ or for questions at the end of this session as well. And we're going to try to end at 10 to allow for 30 minutes of discussion and Q&A in the hopes that you're going to receive some new information today, and we'd like to be able to have the opportunity for you to hear from us as to what our recommendations may be as we start the year off in distance learning. So if you could join me in prayer, put ourselves in the presence of God. I chose a prayer for today that seemed very appropriate. It's a prayer for calm. So we've been on a roller coaster and we've been feeling a lot of anxiety. I know I have, at least, about the uncertainty of everything. So it's nice to be able to put ourselves in the presence of God and reflect on what our purpose is and what our mission is in this work. So in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God, every day I seek to know and feel your presence. When I'm overwhelmed with the details of my life, give me calm so your peace will take hold within. Give me trust to strengthen my faith in all that being one of your children promises. May my devotion and prayer never be far from my mind and heart, encouraging me when I worry. Comfort me when I am anxious. Calm my mind when concerns begin to cloud my prayers, and bring me the grace of serenity that comes only from you. Thank you, God, for all of your love. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. So I'm very honored to be joined by our amazing team that has been working throughout the summer, preparing the recommendations for all of the SD Catholic schools. So we tried our best to have representation from all of the clusters, and we have teachers, we have principals, we have vice principals on our team, we had principals in transition on our team. So we tried to make sure that we're reflecting all of the stakeholders within our diocese when we put together this, these recommendations. So we broke up into 7 subcommittees, with some members served on 2 to 3 different subcommittees. And each subcommittee had a lead, and the leads will be the ones sharing with you today on each of our respective sections. And I know you probably felt the same as I did, overwhelmed by the number of resources that were coming your way. So what we really tried to do is, initially we sifted through all of the research that was coming at us, looking through it, seeing what were the most valuable resources, and then pulling about 10 to really draw from. So you'll see our list of key resources on this slide, and they're all hyperlinked, so I invite you to explore them if you'd like. But we went down these rabbit holes in the hopes that you wouldn't have to. We understand that you have a lot on your plates right now, and it's not looking to lighten up anytime soon. So we did do a lot of extensive research, and we feel like we explored these and pulled from them the best and the clearest, most concise recommendations that we could share with you today. Also, so you know, some of this work is still in progress and it will continue on. I'll continue to update it with the curriculum leadership team throughout the school year, but you'll see that some of these slides are still in a draft form. So be sure to continue to check back as we will make updates as they become available. So this slide is our summary recommendations. And last year, as many of you have heard by now, we referred to that as emergency distance learning. And this year, we're going to need to ensure that we develop policies, procedures, and practices that will serve us well regardless of the context we're in. So the summary recommendations represent key points from each of our subcommittees. And our group will be planning to provide guidance for all scenarios. Our group was planning to provide guidance for all scenarios, but what we ended up shifting to within the past couple of weeks is really focusing on the distance learning piece, as that's what we'll be opening in this school year. And our strongest recommendation is that teachers plan for distance learning using blended learning modalities. and each subcommittee lead will be guiding the overview of her or his section. You can see we have a sort of a overarching timeline for implementation of each of these tasks. We're calling them due next, with the understanding that we know that teachers may not be available over the summer. But we also know that a lot of teachers, you know, their minds are spinning at this time too, and they might be trying to get ahead. So we wanted to put it out there, and we're leveraging the weekly e-news to share each of our tasks, understanding that teachers may or may not be thinking about their planning for this upcoming year before we actually are on our contract time. So the first due, we called this a due now because this was shared before the school year ended, was to identify the unfinished learning from this last school year. So our hope is that this was done in some sort of form, either using this document or using a document on your own. So that way we can actually identify the unfinished learning and try to provide just-in-time remediation this year as we introduce the next grade level content and skills. All right, so our first presenter sharing due next number 1, learning models, will be Marisa Amen. Marisa.
Okay. So I just wanted to, you can all see my screen, we're good? Okay. So this presentation is on our re-engagement website. And so if you're looking to this presentation or your teachers are looking to this presentation, you'll be able to click here for the instructional models checklist. So what we thought would be best would be to create 4 different checklists for 4 different scenarios. Right now, I'm just going to talk about the distance learning checklist since we know we're starting in distance learning, but they are all within the same document. So the other situations we could be in would be short-term closures and quick pivots to distance learning, hybrid learning, and then in-person learning with most students on site. So again, all the checklists are within this same document, but we're just gonna go through the distance learning one this morning. So these are mainly for teachers, but they're also ways for maybe for you as a principal or admin to guide your teachers through this process during those first few meeting days that you have in August. So first we recommend, you know, debriefing learning from spring 2020. We have an article to read. It helps with some decision making and some questions that we may have. Reviewing that unfinished learning document that Julie just talked about. And then we provided 2 different forms for your teachers to reflect or debrief with. And then as teachers, and again, this can be part of a staff meeting or it could be independent time for your teachers, you know, listing strengths that they have as a teacher. And this is where we want our teachers to really step up and be site leaders and saying, I know Google really well and we're going to be using Google Classroom, so let me take on training our staff with Google Classroom, helping them set up their classrooms and going through that process. There's also maybe some teachers who did a really great job with assessment during spring, during distance learning. So how can we leverage our teachers to become leaders during those staff meetings and help assist their coworkers? Also, this is also a good time to kind of think about what are things I want to learn as a teacher, and these debrief forms kind of talk about that as well. Any other learning platforms or tools that they're going to need more training in, and hopefully being able to communicate that to you as their administrator so that we can support them and so that they're best prepared for this process. We still recommend, you know, looking at diagnostic assessments from last year, talking to the grade level below and saying, you know, the class that's coming into me, since we're not going to get to meet them in person at the beginning of the year, really having a good conversation with the previous teacher and saying, how can I best support this class? What should I know about this group of students? We also want to focus our teachers, and we have a whole section on this that Elijah Bondi will be talking about later, but emphasizing our prioritized standards for each subject area, and those will be shared soon. And then making sure we're updating our unit plans and atlas. Again, we'll be focusing on this later as well, but our focus here maybe as administrators can be moving from, you know, weekly lesson plans and focusing more on having our teachers create mini units that are focused on those prioritized standards. So they're not feeling overwhelmed, but there's a way for us to track that they're meeting all the standards. Finally, we have teachers wanting them to create some schedules for parents. We want to make sure that that communication with parents is key this time around. And again, as Julie mentioned before, this isn't emergency distant learning anymore. We are prepared, we are planned, so we want to make sure that parents and students both know what the schedule will be every day or every week. And then we also suggest maybe creating a survey for students to take during that first week of school. You know, we've surveyed our parents, but maybe we can also survey our students and say, what worked well for you during distance learning and what can we do differently? I'll just go ahead and scroll through so you can see the other checklists. There are some overlaps in checklists, so that's helpful. As teachers look at these, hopefully they won't feel so overwhelmed. But again, there's one for short-term closures and one for hybrid learning, which is what I think some of us were planning on starting with, and now we're going to distance learning. And then finally, full-on in-person learning. And again, there is a focus and emphasis with our team talking about blended learning, so there's some resources hyperlinked in there as well. Okay. And then Julie was going to talk about instructional minutes.
Great, thank you, Marisa.
Okay.
Okay, the other link on this Due Next #1 is new, and this is the instructional minutes for distance learning. So this has been a question that I've received a few times over the past week, now knowing that we're shifting to that model. And so I'd like to make sure that you're aware that this is here. So the overview, of course, at the top, and then it breaks it down by grade level. And these instructional minutes are based on, so the minimums in each of the range are based on AB 77 from California. So it's the California state minimum. And then the range, the upper end of the range would be an hour longer than the California state minimum. Keep in mind that the instructional minutes aren't referring to online time. And so what we tried to do is provide you some samples of how this time could be broken up. Obviously, during the school day, when we're still thinking about a 6.5-hour school day, an example would be 8 to 2:30. We provided some sample schedules here. So if you'd like to also share the schedules that you're developing, please do, and I'll add this to the samples included in here. So they're broken down by grade level, and we also have screen time maxes for each grade level. And these are based on the National Board Certified Teachers put out some screen time recommendations, of course, that have been adapted because of COVID, and with the recognition and understanding that students will need to be on the screens a bit more, but we also don't want to exceed a certain amount of time each day. So this 3 hours was actually meant for high school, but we brought it down to grade 6 through 12. So do know that that's a recommended maximum. If you scroll down too, you'll see the sample schedules for each grade level, but you'll also see some key tips for lesson unit design. And we suggest too really going through this with your teachers, because when they first see these allocations, they might feel overwhelmed, like, how am I going to use all of that time? I can't be on Zoom all day long. And we don't expect them to be on Zoom all day long with their students. We need to be really intentional about breaking that time up to provide for a number of synchronous, asynchronous, whole group, small group, online and offline activities. So sample building blocks of online lessons. But what we've also done too is if you go to these hyperlinks, you'll see some really specific breakdowns for lessons by grade level. So what could this look like? And we used a lot of Catlin Tucker's research and work to devise these. So it's broken down by grade level. It talks about how station rotations could be utilized within the classroom, and gives a basic structure of a station rotation lesson. We've done this for playlists. We're working on this for choice boards now. But again, I'd recommend that you allow your teachers some time when you get back to school to really explore these and to see what their lessons might look like. Because what we heard from parents overwhelmingly was what doesn't work for them is for teachers to say, okay, here are your assignments. We're going to do 1 hour, see you tomorrow or the next day. They need to be engaged somehow throughout the day without necessarily being online throughout the day. Also, here are some great links that we've been finding too for virtual engagement strategies. So again, we want teachers to think about how this could look different. So we're not just trying to replicate what's happening in the classroom. We're actually using best practices to engage students in an online environment. So a number of these resources have included tools that you could use for either online guidance, or you could also use for offline. So I'd encourage you to look through these too. Again, it gives teachers lots of very practical tips for designing these lessons and units. Some notes at the bottom, and these clarify some of what's in AB 77, and they also clarify the attendance too. So again, attendance last year or during emergency distance learning was pretty flexible. We said even at the end of the week you could take attendance. But what we're asking now is that you do take daily attendance and that students are accountable for the work and for participating in daily instruction. And again, each school is different and each school serves a different community. So working with your teachers to define what that might look like. Some of the hyperlinks of references that we used are located here. Okay, so again, this is linked on Due Next #1, and we'll continue, like all the documents on here, to update as new information becomes available, but this might be a good starting point for you to begin sharing with your teachers. All right, on to Due Next #2, best practices, and that's Amanda. Amanda, you're on mute.
Thank you. What I was saying was this was released about a month ago with the screencast in the Office for Schools weekly newsletter. But I just wanted to spend some time going over the checklist. And so what you'll notice is that this is one checklist for both in-person and online learning, because best practices are true no matter where the learning is taking place. And so we tried to find as many commonalities as possible, and for you to have as many considerations for that in-person learning for when you pivot to distance learning and vice versa. It sounds like we're going to likely be starting distance learning. And so that's kind of something to keep in mind. And it builds off of what Marisa first talked about, which was after you've taken a look at what worked really well, what didn't work as well, you should use that to kind of inform your plans moving forward. And so that's the first part of the year. We want, right before school starts, we want you making sure you complete that. And then we want you to give your teachers an opportunity to start thinking about their long range plans. And I know Elijah will be talking about this a little bit later, but the idea of them planning out with the end in mind, because we're going to have to be very specific and very, we're going to have to really choose those critical pieces that we need to make sure to address, as well as address anything that may have gone unfinished in the previous year in order to accelerate the learning. And so Atlas is going to be a great tool, and I know Elijah will talk more about that a little bit later. We're also saying that as a staff, you should come together and determine which tech tools you're going to use. It's going to be really important that we keep those to a minimum, mainly around the idea of streamlining communication. We don't want one, for example, like let's say you want to use Class Dojo as a way to communicate out with parents, but then the second grade teacher chooses to use Bloom. That becomes very confusing for parents to be checking Dojo and Bloom and this and that. And so coming together as a consensus about what are you going to use to communicate, what are you going to use to deliver those, to deliver the learning, whether that be Google Classroom or Seesaw. It might not be the same site-wide, it might be grade bands, but there should be some continuity throughout that, as well as anything else you might want. So if there are tools that are doing a similar thing, perhaps you'd agree as a staff to all decide that for doing videos where we just want to get a quick understanding of their knowledge, we're going to use Flipgrid as opposed to finding something else that's similar, which confuses the process for parents. This is particularly important with the lower grades. The middle school students who are a little more independent can handle a little bit more, but being really intentional with that. And then another group worked really hard on evaluating and updating the grading practices, feedback and assessment, which will be talked a little bit later, but it's all linked here as well. And then we move into the ongoing throughout the school year. And so this is where there'll be a lot of resources for you and for your teachers to kind of go and look and think about things as they're building out their lessons and delivering content. And so really thinking about what you're teaching and why, determining the necessary supports and scaffold for the various subgroups, which is going to be really important in distance learning. What's their access to tech? What kind of supports might they need for students who might be struggling just in school or even in distance learning, and so forth. Another thing is thinking about how you're going to deliver the content. And so through a lot of our research, we believe that using some blended learning methods would be really valuable in all types of settings. And so starting to explore that, incorporate some of those practices so that you can begin to personalize that learning and scaffold it for our students. And then a lot of focus on more active learning as opposed to a checklist of things to do. And so how can we engage our students in a meaningful way virtually? And so we have some ideas and tips there, and we'll be growing those with links and supports for what that might look like in distance learning. In fact, there is up here under these the building blocks for online learning. This is a great tool that comes from Catlin Tucker that focuses on the building block, the different types of things you want to hit both in person and online, but then it shows you some online tools you can use to support that type of thinking and that type of work in an online setting. And so this will be a great tool to share with your teachers. And then at the bottom on the resources, the whole blog post is posted. So you can also hear Catlin Tucker's thinking behind this as well. And then really focusing on making sure that we're chunking it into smaller pieces that are more manageable, not these long 30-minute math lessons, but more like 6 minutes with more practice for work, or, you know, if you're going to move more into a synchronous type setting, breaking that up in a way that allows the students to digest the content a little bit more, as opposed to just feeling like they're sitting there for a long time listening to the same thing. And then the more you can incorporate student choice, the better. We're going to be growing out our student choice options. For right now, there is one example, and the reason this one's on there is because it shows choice boards for distance learning, but the good part about it is that it gives options for both on the screen and also something that they can do off the screen. And so as we're trying to be mindful of engaging them at home, both on the screen, but also giving them off-screen activities, this might be a really great reproducible option that teachers can use. I know it has a lot. If you read the post, it'll explain, don't start with all of them, start with a few, but this gives you a lot of different just general ideas about how you can engage them in both kind of aspects. And then lastly, we have lists of both synchronous and asynchronous considerations. And so you'll be able to click on these and see the different types of recommendations based off of a large variety of resources. I mean, our group has been on countless websites, read books, you know, listen articles, whatever it might be. And so we tried to pick the things that kind of kept popping up over and over and over again, and that seemed to make the most sense for what we were striving to do based off of all of our conversations, you know, through the different schools. And so you'll have those, and those will be growing kind of as we go. And kind of like what Julie said, as you find resources that support any of this stuff, feel free to always send it our way so that we can grow it. I think the biggest thing for us as principals right now is that we are all trying to recreate the wheel. And so if we share the resources, we can kind of share that burden, and we can make everyone's school system better as opposed to just trying to fight through and burn out on our own. And I think that's it. And so we have our resources down below, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Well said, Amanda. So again, just feel free to pass anything you're creating along to me or to anyone in this group, and we'll make sure to put it in a repository so that all can benefit and see what's been done, so we can grow our collective capacity there. All right, next up we have Elijah. So Elijah is going to be sharing Do Next number 3 and 4. Take it away, Elijah.
All right. All right, there we go. So Do Next number 3 is around prioritized standards. And so the idea here is there's too many standards as it is in Common Core to hit everything in the course of a year. And so we need to, as a best practice, anytime really pick those standards that are going to have the highest leverage moving student learning forward. When we start talking about, you know, emergency distance learning and distance learning to start the year and periodic interruptions in learning because of going to have distance learning for temporary closures, like we need to be even more precise and more focused in what we're doing. So what we did was we looked at both Renaissance and Achieve the Core, or the Student Achievement Partners, and picked out a set of standards that's linked here. I'm not going to click on it right now, but it has basically all of the research, there's a ton of information that they did on picking what they feel like are the high leverage standards. And so we basically used that to create a set for the diocese. Now, normally when you do prioritized standards, there's a lot more back and forth with the process to hold it up against your curriculum maps and things like that, so that you can really hone in on, well, what are the prioritized standards for your system? We don't have time for that because the school year starts very soon and we need to get this to people. So this will be a living document. I'm sure CLT, we're going to be picking this up. I'm on CLT, so I can help continue the conversation. But basically for you, look at the standards, get reviewed on them, and then as you at your school site, that you might say, hey, we need to add these standards in addition because we feel like these ones are also priority for our community. I have a very large English language learner population, so that might change the prioritized standards that I want to indicate. So just know that that flexibility is there, but we wanted to have kind of a universal starting place. This document here is a really easy document that we put together. It's just a one-pager. It has all of the English standards on one page, and then all of the math standards on one page with the prioritized standards indicated. So if you went through and did all of that unfinished learning from the Do Now, your teachers can go in there and put that information in, whether it was partially addressed, not addressed at all, or if they felt like they had taught it fully before the closure in March. And then that way you have one document that you can share with your next grade level teachers because everybody's on there. And so as you're looking at your long plans, which is the next, do next, you can see where the gaps are. And so you can do some of this just in time remediation rather than having extended periods of remediation, which extended periods of remediation, the research is saying is just going to set your kids back. And then it just basically you're perpetuating the gap into the next school year, rather than teaching content standards and just kind of saying, hey, we need to do a mini lesson on multiplying the fractions because that was one of the things we didn't hit fully last year. So check out that document as something to help with. Do next number 4 is around creating these year-long plans. So looking at the big picture. And then our recommendation is around this idea of mini units. So looking at kind of creating the year-long plan, we recommend doing this in Atlas. Atlas has a really nice format where you can basically take the topic for each unit or the title for your units. And again, we're trying to encourage people not to get hung up on what the title is. That's not as important right now, but just to put in the units with the number of weeks that you want it to cover and get your year mapped out from day one. What this will do, and then as we talk about mini notes, we'll talk about how you add in the standards to make sure you're kind of hitting all of those prioritized standards throughout the course of the year. If you want to use the Google Calendar or another system that your school uses, that's fine as well. But we do recommend Atlas just because it has some features that we can do some sessions on later about how you can run some reports about making sure that you're hitting all of those prioritized standards. And as an administrator, once you know how to run those reports, your life becomes really easy as far as where are we at, what are we doing. So that's for year-long planning and just kind of making sure that we're not kind of, if we're doing it where we're building as we go, I have some teachers that like to do that where they don't want to look more than 2 weeks out. That becomes really disjointed for the kids and for the parents when they're at home. And so if we know what our roadmap is for the year, it does make our lives a lot easier from the beginning. This idea of mini units. So typically we talk in units or in lesson plans. So one of the big recommendations from our group is to shift to asking your teachers to turn in mini units rather than turning in lesson plans. And again, this reinforces the idea of the longer trajectory, planning things out and knowing where you're going rather than doing things week by week that, in a stressful time becomes really disjointed. So the idea of a mini unit in comparison to a regular unit is that a mini unit is 2 to 3 weeks versus a full unit, which is typically 4 to 6 weeks. We do this so that it becomes really small. We pick 2 to 3 prioritized standards within that mini unit. We pick 2 or 3 learning intentions and success criteria. And that way we're honing in on just something very specific for the teacher and for the students to focus on. that we can assess at the end in a nice creative, and you'll hear about good assessment practices in a little bit, but that way we can really stay focused. And then we move through these little chunks throughout the year that are really well laid out from our year-long plan, and we know where we're going. What do we want in a mini unit? Well, in a mini unit, you have your learning intentions and success criteria. This is also kind of the, taking the place of the big idea. So basically, what are they going to be learning, and how can they show you what they've learned? Like when will you know that they're successful in reaching mastery in that? Have those best practices for teaching that, have the assessment around how the kids will show you that they've learned that material, and then what are the really high quality instructional content or resources that we're putting into that unit so that the kids can get the material. This unit is put into Atlas. So when you go to Atlas, you can see we've built in this essential elements piece. So it has the prioritized standards. So you can go through and the teachers can just pick those in Atlas. All the prioritized standards are indicated with a little P. And then there's actually a P2. The P2 is in language arts for the kind of a second level of priority standards. Then you can see the big idea, the learning intention success criteria. So teacher can write those in, the activities, the assessments, and the resources. So this makes it really easy. We did keep all of the other things that were in the unit maps. So if your teachers have good information there, it's not gone. It's just pushed down into the supporting elements so they can find it really easily. So just know that all of that is there in Atlas. We did create, using Catlin Tucker's work, a Google Doc version of this also, just because not every school is using Atlas, and sometimes teachers like to use some non-digital, they want to print something out, write it out, and then you can have them uploaded into Atlas after the fact. So if your teachers prefer to do things in Google Docs, this would be a good format. And so all of this is linked here. I'll refer to next, number 4. So, thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Elijah. And just to add on to what he said too, so those prioritized standards are flagged in Atlas, and they're also in the process of being flagged in SchoolSpeak if you're a SchoolSpeak user. Okay, on to the next, let's see. Do next, which is number 5, feedback, assessment, and grading. And let me just see. We're gonna have Tori kick it off. So Tori, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Okay, so our committee worked on feedback, assessment, and grading, and the feedback and assessment loop are so closely related to each other. They kind of go hand in hand. And so we created these quick tip overview documents, and this is a close-up of the feedback document that is a snapshot for your teachers. Now we're in the weeds. This is where teachers like to exist, in the weeds of the actual day-to-day with our students. And giving timely feedback is important. So this document is to help teachers take a look at what their feedback practices are and how can we improve them, how can we move from one modality to the other quickly with our students still being introduced in our routine with our feedback procedures. So we begin with a look at, and it's a T-chart essentially all the way through, what feedback normally looks like in person. As teachers, we are very good at in the moment and being able to evaluate what our students need. It got very challenging in distance learning, particularly when we had kids who were disengaged and were not logging in, who we did not see regularly on a Zoom session. So we offer some tips for distance learning feedback and what that can look like as well. There are lots of hyperlinks throughout this document as well for those who want to go a little deeper in the process. The mid part of this document talks about synchronous versus asynchronous tools. Again, we wanted to create a document for our teachers that they can use right away. Like, I'm a teacher, I want, just give me the stuff. I want to be able to look very quickly at tools that I will find helpful in my own classroom. So we divided the document into here are some tools you can use for feedback when you're in a synchronous environment, when you're online with the kids, versus learning how to balance that in an asynchronous environment as well. And finally, we have our resources linked here at the bottom as well. Again, if you want to do a deeper dive, if your teachers want to do a deeper dive. The second part is the assessment of our student learning. And I was reading in the Fisher-Fry Distance Learning Handbook about how they are tied to each other. The assessment should lead to feedback. Assessment can't be a one and done, which I'm an old school teacher who it used to be that way for me. Like, here's your test, we're done, let's move on to some new information. What we're learning is that is not helpful for the students, that we need to engage our students in this process of feedback and assessment. The assessment should be a tool to help them learn further. We've also talked about in the Fisher-Fry book about giving high information feedback. Where am I going from the student's perspective? Where am I going? How am I going there? And where will I go next? Assessment is that piece that helps students also understand how to navigate those three different fields. We broke this down into similar way of looking at it. We took a look at what assessment should be and what it should not be. We also went on to kind of prompt our teachers, how frequently am I assessing my students? And we also offered ideas or tools for them to take a look at. If you're going to assess them daily, and we should be assessing them daily, this is what it looks like, whether we're face-to-face or whether we're online. And the span ranges all the way from exit tickets to more ongoing assessments, student blogs, portfolio collection of their learning, so that over time, students can look back and say, this is where I was, here's my progression, and look, where did I end up? A lot of metacognition is built into assessment pieces rather than simple, just spit out what I've learned. How do we make the shift from traditional assessments that all teachers are used to? How do we make that shift into whatever our new context may be? That's the third part of the chart. It's pretty clearly broken down. Under the standardized test, I linked the Renaissance testing booklet, which talks about all the reports, all the information we can in fact get from our Renaissance testing. And here are some assessments for teachers, regardless of what modality we're in. And then finally, the final section is for teachers to get started. And in my video that's also linked on the slide, I challenge teachers. We're not trying to do an overhaul of what we're doing. What we are trying to do is pick one or two practices that we can change. So the last part of this chart is broken down into, instead of doing these more traditional practices that are listed here, and these traditional practices are great, they're fine, but they don't always work in an asynchronous environment. They don't always translate into an online course. Here's what we might try instead for assessing our kids. Assessment was a huge piece that teachers were worried about when I was conducting the teacher meetups. That was our constant conversation in middle school. How do we assess and give feedback to our students? So we hope that this document helps. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over for the third piece to Julie.
Thanks, Tori. And Tori is very passionate. She actually keeps going on, we'll give her a task to work on or something, and she goes down those rabbit holes and finds more and more great resources and useful strategies that she wants to include. So I'm sure this is going to be a work in progress as well. So thank you, Tori. Grading, let's see, did I switch? I'm just going to share my screen. By far the most asked question that I received during the distance learning period was related to grading. And I think what we learned too, especially in traditional grading for achievement-based, it didn't really translate to distance learning. And so there were lots of issues about, well, what about the zero? What if the student didn't do his work or her work? Or what do I do about the report card? So our biggest recommendation here is to establish policies and procedures that are going to work, again, regardless what context you're in. So if we start out in distance learning and then go back in person, or if we go to a hybrid model, the grading policies should not shift. We should have some expectations of what that's going to look like. And basically what we're asking to do is adopt a standards referenced mindset. So it's not necessarily shifting this year to standards reference grading, but it's incorporating some of those shifts that are inherent in standards reference grading. Basically, you know, basing student grades on progress towards standards, eliminating zeros, and actually looking at student growth and focusing on the learning piece. So what we try to do here too is just provide bullet points basically about what a grade should be and what a grade should not be. And this is information too that you could share with your students, share with your families ahead of time too, and get their feedback on it. Because again, these are practices that are just good practices that we want to encourage in our schools that would last well beyond the distance learning environment. So again, this focuses on prioritizing standards, deeper levels of understanding. So instead of having different categories for homework, classwork, tests, that all kind of blurs together in this type of environment. What we're really looking at are skills, standards that students are working toward, and what is their progress in those standards. We want to stop looking at the averages by looking at the total points earned, and think about it as where are they in relation to a standard. So one of the biggest things that you want to think about with your staff too is how to reduce the number of grading distinctions. So we just shouldn't, you know, we all know, like, there's really, how can we tell what the difference is between a 74 and a 75? So what we're asking to is reduce those. So here are just some ways to think about that this year and hopefully into the future. So that way, you know, if a student earns a 4, it means something. If a student earns a 90, it means something. And what does that mean? How can I tell what that means in relation to what the student knows and is able to do? So if you're using SRG, we encourage you to continue that practice, because again, those practices lend themselves well to a distance learning environment, hybrid, in person. But if you're not, here are some, again, considerations we want you to review and consider taking on this year to adopt a more standards referenced mindset. Here are some resources down below, and be happy to answer any questions you have on that. We'll also be adding a video overview within the next couple of days here. Okay, again, the document's linked here. And there's also finally a summary checklist at the bottom that incorporates the key elements of the feedback, assessment, and grading. And that's still in its draft form, but that will be updated in the next couple of days as well. Okay, next up we have Mark with due next number 7, social emotional learning. So Mark, you're on.
Thank you, Julie. Let me screen share. I think you're still on. There we go. Thank you. So for the group that did social emotional learning, we kind of started with 2 premises. One obviously was the fact that different schools, different individuals would be in different types of learning. So we kind of anticipated at some time during the year, some schools in the diocese could quite possibly be in full-on in-person on-campus learning, while other parts of the county might still be in a situation where they're doing full distance learning, and then obviously every combination of hybrids and such in between. And so the needs around social emotional learning might be quite different for a child who's sitting at home on a screen watching his or her classmates back on campus than the kids who are on campus looking at each other with face masks and possibly worrying about getting infected and having to go back into distance learning. So it's challenging around that work. So we try to capture it around that premise. The second premise, of course, was geared around the fact that what schools had in place currently around social emotional learning. And what we found was that we had the range from schools that have social emotional learning programs or are getting assistance from possibly counselors, psychologists. We have ones that are in a program that's maybe more home-based and homemade. And then we had some that felt, well, I'm not sure we actually have a social emotional learning program at all, or relying very heavily on our religion, faith-based classwork to create our SEL. And so we try to be of assistance to all of the folks operating in those different types of SEL learning models. So starting off, and I'm not going to pull up every link because we're just not going to have time and it's not necessary, but we started off, first of all, giving the schools a checklist. Most of our work and data comes from collaborative around academic, social, emotional learning, CASEL. So most of our work and the links in that world are operating from there. The other work, which is what is social emotional learning? So we wanted to start with an element of a definition. So we needed a working definition around the term social emotional learning. So we tried to provide that because we felt like just all the work in this, having common language, is crucial to all of that. And it's managing emotions, achieving positive goals, empathy, positive relationships, and obviously responsible decision-making is crucial. Around that. The ideas around primary areas of focus. So when you look at the CASEL work that they have, it's quite thorough. So we try to group the work into 3 major areas. We felt the community and relationship building was going to be very important, especially for that point I made just a few minutes ago, which again is you're going to probably have at some point kids come back on campus or even virtually in distance learning on your own. And there'll be kids that are no longer in your classes, or you'll have kids that are brand new to your school that don't know anybody in the school. And so you're going to have to be able to manage and build community and relationships almost, if not totally from scratch, definitely with that in mind, and keeping in mind that last time when we went to distance learning, the kids already had their homeroom teacher for about 2/3 of the year. Now they're trying to get used to a brand new teacher, and all those things, of course, will force us to go back into some community relationship building. The stress coping and resilience. I mean, kids obviously being at home and being in this modality of separation, of feeling, do I go back into distance learning once I go back in campus? And all the stress and the mental health issues that are really involved with being in distance learning need to be focused in on. And then, of course, the third one, which is the empathy, equity, and compassion. While our kids have been out of our direct care since March, and certainly during the summer months, we've also to the forefront have been forced to deal with head-on issues around racism and inequality. And then obviously that's lent itself to possibly a whole nother wave, which is, scenes of violence and protests and things being destroyed. And so, kids have been exposed to this, all of this in March, in addition to distance learning. And so our SEL work, we felt, should focus on those key areas. And then kind of the last couple of things just to main on. So creating an SEL program, we don't need a link on these slides right here, but basically the creation of an SEL program, there's the CASEL playbook is in there that really allows you to how to review and open up a program, steps to take. We provided a list of SEL programming and resources. Some of those are paid partnerships where if you feel as a principal or as a school, we need a lot more help and we're running out of time, there are some really quality programs listed. Again, some come with fees, they partner with you, others, they're resources. It'll also be things in there like surveys that you can kind of get a benchmark where you are as a school. And then the last thing I want to mention just very briefly is do not forget about your teachers and their needs as well. And in 2 areas, where are they socially, emotionally? And obviously we'll get a head start on that in August when we reconvene, but also where is their skill set in being able to successfully go into social emotional learning? Because the one safeguard I just want to caution all of us against is that what most of the teachers in our group didn't want to have happen is a principal putting up a slideshow stressing this is social emotional learning and then giving them basically a slide deck with 200 links in it and basically put the burden completely on them as individuals to develop social emotional learning programming without considering the bandwidth that they may have to do that successfully.
Thank you, Mark. And I know you had been planning on at Nativity implementing a social emotional learning program this year. So you had done some research well ahead of time. So we appreciate you digging even deeper. And also one of the key resources, of course, was the CASEL SEL roadmap, which is linked on the slide as well. So a lot there but I know Mark would be willing to have conversations with you around that as well, since he's done some extensive research in that area. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And our final piece is going to be Jennifer. So Jennifer Miller is going to be talking about parent engagement, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So Jennifer.
Okay. Hi. So everything we've been learning and here in this presentation, it's just, circling in our minds here, focused on students, focused on best practices, and we really need to keep in mind is the parents and communicating all these wonderful things that we're doing. When students are feeling connected to all of the adults and the teachers and volunteers, everybody in the school community, they're more likely to remain engaged in their participation and their learning online or hopefully when we go back on site. Again, when parents feel included, they're getting these emails or they're getting these phone calls, or they're reaching out to the school and making suggestions or asking questions. And when they're actually being heard, they are going to trust the work of us at our schools and our decision making. So we made a few different slides for you to kind of remind you of all the wonderful things you probably already do, or maybe have done in the past or have thought about doing in the future. So starting off with the administrator's best practices. To remind you of some things to do, just to add to your list for prior to starting up the school year, is to remember to go and update everything from on your website, your MLS or your LMS. And another thing is to go as an outsider on the internet and just type in your school name and see if any old links to your websites come up. Just make sure everything's fresh. Survey your families, identify if they have any technology or internet needs. There are links at the end of this, these slides to help you reach out and connect families to internet. There's also, sorry, I didn't mention this, the parent resources. There's a lot of parent resources up here, and also the survey resources are from the County Office of Ed. They've been really helpful with giving us ideas. Share your school calendar as soon as you can, at least for back to school nights or orientations, or supply pickups, or anything upcoming that's community building. And schedule professional learning for parents. We're going to go into that more in a little bit, but the sooner that you can get those dates out there, the better, so you can get some higher attendance, hopefully. Remind your office staff to be aware of events and news that are upcoming. When the phone rings or emails come in, it's going to be much better for them to know exactly what's going on right away, so they can communicate that. And then establish a consistent information delivery schedule between teachers and parents. One thing you may have noticed was when we went into our crisis learning mode during quarantine is information was being delivered all times of day, all times of the week. And it got frustrating for parents because they didn't remember what came in for which student or which child or which teacher said what. So if we can all get on a schedule that maybe all the emails go out one day a week for the week, then it might help everybody stay a little bit more organized. Then ongoing throughout the school year, consider having a virtual coffee with stakeholders. Keep your website current for sure. And then also consider sending out more surveys periodically. There's a lot of great ideas here from the County Office of Ed, just to keep a pulse on your emotional temperature of your school community. Have daily video updates, or maybe you have a daily assembly or daily message going out. And then a virtual parent board meetings or PGG, or just a state of the school. And then schedule on various nights. A lot of us like to stick to our, okay, every Wednesday night at 6 o'clock, or every Thursday after school. Try and vary that for parents that are now, just trying to make it work with work schedules. And then we're suggesting to make an effort to do a weekly e-blast or newsletter. Maybe bi-weekly is okay, but definitely monthly is going to be a little bit too much lag time for communicating with your community. Ensure accessibility to this information. So keep in mind the various languages in your community. Leverage leverage parent volunteers who might be willing to translate for you. Create a system to track these communications that go out from the office or from anyone, teachers. Be clear and concise and empathetic, especially during times of stress. You know, when you're stressed and you read something and then you go back and read it later on when you're not stressed, you may have read two different things. So just keep that in mind. Next is the best practices for teachers. This could be created as a checklist for you to kind of walk through with your teachers at the beginning of the school year, is to have them definitely update their own websites, whether you use Weebly, Google Sites, update their classroom, Google Classroom or Seesaw. Definitely make that touch point and have them send out a welcome letter or an email to students and have them share their excitement. It's a great thing for a student to receive actual mail in the mail, not email, but actual snail mail. It's amazing how you can start the year off on the right foot that way. And then suggesting writing a letter introducing yourself professionally and personally as a teacher can definitely bridge the gap in communication, start the year off right as well. And of course, updating classroom handbooks. There's a suggestion here to create a cheat sheet page with any website, app, username, logins, anything that's going to be needed throughout the year, and have it in one place so that it's an easy go-to when students have homework or they have to take an AR test or they have to log into Google Classroom or whatever. It's all in one place, and for the busy family, they can go reach for that one piece of paper and look at it together. And then also plan a back-to-school session for parents. There's a wonderful article here that use some ideas since we have to be creative in our virtual society. Highly suggested to accommodate various parent work schedules. Also, having a positive phone call going home in the first 2 weeks is a wonderful touch point to have a positive connection prior to any concerns that come up throughout the school year. Responding to emails within 24 hours definitely keeps communication strong. And then reaching out to families if a student starts to all of a sudden become disengaged or lack quality in work or seem to have a change in behavior. And then we also suggest that teachers communicate weekly how students are doing, whether that be through rubrics or through the LMS with timely posting of grades. And then offer distance learning model navigation sessions after school hours, which goes into our parent training, which is right here. So we also suggest having areas of professional learning throughout the year that we schedule out to offer parents the opportunity to learn a little bit more about how to use things that your school already uses. So we're not asking you to add anything new to their plates. We're just asking you to think about reaching out and saying, well, tonight we're going to be showing you how to use Google Classroom. We're going to walk you through it. We're also going to spend maybe 10 minutes on teaching your child to self-advocate, or we're going to spend another evening, maybe 20, 30 minutes on SRG, and here's why we've chosen SRG, and here's why it works. And so just having parents be able to be part of the learning community is going to make your connection a lot stronger. And this can be done live through whole group or interactive or breakout sessions, or you could just record these screencasts and then maybe periodically have a live Q&A or not live Q&A. You can do and have them email you and answer when it's convenient for you. This was the self-advocating slide. Now this is going to be built up. This is how can we foster community and distance learning. Now we do know that we can invite families to weekly mass outdoors, and we're going to hope that as things become clearer and we get everything is going to keep changing. We know that. Hopefully we can host athletic sessions, but we have to be really careful and keep our eye on small cohorts and non-contact. So that's just going to remain right there as when permitted. So keep coming back here and we'll see what we can come up with as a creative community. And then lastly, we have a lot of sample letters and communications here. So it's suggested that prior to all the crisis of pivoting back and forth, that you take some time to look through some of these letters and perhaps draft your own. So when we do get the okay to come back to school, you have your letters ready. Or when something happens and you need to communicate to the schools saying that God forbid we have to close. You got your letters ready. So all of that is here for you to hopefully save you time in a stressful situation. And good luck with everything. God bless you all.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good timing. We're just at 10 o'clock right now. So again, this group has been amazing. It's been, one of my favorite meetings of the week, each week, to check in on progress, and everyone's been participating in numerous webinars, reading all these articles and books. So again, huge kudos to our team who's been so impactful during this time too. And I know they'll continue to provide resources to us as time goes on. So this is a lot of information, and we're aware that when we share the slide deck in the weekly e-notice, that it's a little bit, we didn't want it to seem intimidating. So it's only, I think, about 13 slides, but as you dig into each slide, you'll see that there are more resources there. So what we'll be doing too is we're going to pull that slide deck too. Currently it's on the school re-engagement site on the professional learning website, but we're going to update that distance learning website that I had last year, and that's going to be the continuity of learning website. And we're going to pull all these resources and organize them, so it'll be a one-stop shop where you can find everything related to curriculum and instruction for this upcoming year. So again, that's going to be in progress. This work is just still continuing. We're still meeting one more time as a working group. So again, we'll be updating all of this, and it will be shared on our professional learning website on a dedicated page to continuity of learning for this upcoming year. If you have resources, like I said, please continue to share those with us, and we will add those to our repository, so that way we can share our work. Okay, we do have some time now. We planned until 10:30. If there are any questions, or if someone wants to share a resource that they've created with the group, now would be a great time.
I have a question, more for just professional input for everybody and teachers specifically, because I'm thinking for teachers right now. So my schedule for distance learning has synchronous and asynchronous in the morning and small group in the afternoon. And what we've kind of realized is I would love the teachers to be able to separate the kids in small groups by content area ability, but that would be a scheduling nightmare, and it'd be really hard for kids to show up consistently because they would be in different groups for different classes at different times every day. And I don't think that's going to be realistic. So we're going to have to have them just be divided into small groups across all the grade levels. But something that came up, I hosted a live Q&A for parents last night, and one of the questions was, since the kids aren't getting to see each other in person, can we switch those groups somewhat regularly, the small groups, so that they're interacting with other kids, which I was happy to do. But I'm wondering, based on this group's kind of research, would it make sense for the teachers to divide the kids up based on ability for those small groups so that we could differentiate? Again, it has to be across the board. It can't just be specific content. Or would you recommend just, heterogeneous groupings that rotate every month? Because I'm not sure what to do on that, if anyone has any feedback.
My suggestion at first would be to keep the groupings flexible, as flexible as possible, and also looking at those prioritized standards, and when you're focusing on areas where students, maybe there's a certain group of students who are struggling with a particular concept or standard, maybe doing some homogeneous grouping at that point, but also being flexible to that heterogeneous grouping as time goes on, so they're not limited to one group.
I'm more worried about the consistency of them showing up at the right time. So, right now it's like 1 o'clock, 1:20, 1:40, they're going to be assigned a time. So I want them to at least have it for like a week or two so that they'd show up at that time. So it feels kind of like rigid in that sense, where I would prefer if it was like every day we could switch your group, but I also know that means kids aren't going to show up. But yeah, I guess if I leave it up to the teachers and maybe have like a 2-week minimum at least, so that it's consistent for them to show up, and then we can adjust. But the hard part, I guess, for the teachers is they're all going to have to agree on which kids belong in each group, because again, I can't individualize it per content area, or kids would be like 1 o'clock here, 1:20. It just would be so hard to keep up with. So it's like the blessing and curse of trying to do small grouping, of how do you make it authentic and for what it's meant for, but how do you also keep it so that kids show up on time and know what to expect every day. But yeah, that's good. Maybe even 2 weeks. That's a good
thing. One thing you can look at doing is if you run your STAR data early in the year, And if you have your year-long plans aligned to prioritized standards, then you could actually
Group the kids that way, right?
know when kids will be in need of being in high priority groups at different points in the year,
Right.
and kind of build a rough plan from day one. Yeah, well, day September when they take STAR testing.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah, I think you're right. It has to be, well, the parent asking last night reminded me that like they also see this as social interaction with other kids. And this was a mom whose kid is new to this school. So that was, I didn't even think about that of like, yeah, this is a way they could also meet other students. So yeah, all very good ideas. Thanks.
Could I speak a little bit? I did a lot of small groups and it was amazingly helpful. Because I'm a parent, I was thinking about trying to keep them at the same time, the same week. So, at the beginning of the year, we don't know where the kids are that much. But trying to keep them the same schedule, but then when I saw a need for a change, I kind of like weighed in on it and said, okay, like I could kind of still meet their needs. But then when I knew I couldn't, I emailed the parents and said, you know what, I really would like to switch their time. And just, so I was switching, but I was really mindful, like, do I really need to switch? Because like once a month would be more like, oh, let's switch up the groups a little bit. But because it was need-based, like I could have done Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm gonna meet the same time with your reading, but then Tuesday, Thursday, math groups need to be different. So, but just thinking about consistency for parents was really, really helpful. So.
Great, thank you. I appreciate, that's what I'm trying to think of too, of parents of trying to schedule their day around their kids' schedule. We want it to be consistent. So thank you.
One just quick recommendation, as I would recommend that you push out those teacher meetups to your teachers as well. And I know we've had some Drexel teachers participate. Talina facilitates that TKK group. And I was just going to ask her to share because she did that brilliantly. And she shared with the California Curriculum Committee a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was just last week. And just some of her ideas for that small grouping were just really, ways to create impact while also being mindful of the parents and the consistency in the scheduling. So this is just a reminder to all, if you want to share that again, that link to those teacher meetups, as we'll have those teacher liaisons facilitating these discussions. And they can really help to get in the weeds of specific grade levels, which, we all have the grades that we taught when we were in the classroom. But I think hearing specifically from grade level leaders would be helpful. Any other questions, thoughts? I know Jennifer Meza asked about STAR testing. We are planning on STAR testing, and I know Matthew's going to be sharing information about that, about remote administration.
I have another one, but I don't want to jeopardize.
Let's see. I'm going to look through and see if anyone else's hands are raised. Anyone else have a thought? Kelly, go for it.
Okay, I'm assuming people have this too. So again, we have the blessing of a lot of new students that came to us this year from different grade levels, which is great. But like I think Tori said, or someone said, starting the school year with new teachers, maybe it was Mark, is really hard because they're at a new school and new teachers. I also have a lot of kindergartners who've never been to school before. So I'm wondering if, and this is, I know we have to be really careful about not having live instruction on campus. And I made that very clear to parents that that's not a possibility right now. But is there an idea that we can host kind of community building sessions or like one-on-ones with their teacher so they can get to know their teacher and feel comfortable at school, as long as we're social distance, masks, following rules, at least for the first few weeks of school? It kind of ties to the social emotional part. I don't know how you get kindergartners engaged with a teacher they've met maybe once, or how you get, we have, again, a lot of transfer students who don't know a single student or their teacher. So what are creative ways we can leverage the rules with in-person by being very safe? Again, because I can host a tour socially distanced with masks. Why can't I host a one-on-one with a kid? So I don't know if anyone else has thought of that, because that's something that's a major concern for a lot of my families that have never been to school here before.
I haven't found out yet if this is allowed, but I was kind of considering trying to explore if we could do a kindergarten, like boot camp, almost like a day camp where there's no instruction and we break them up and practice all the things about a day camp that has nothing to do with instruction, but just more orienting them. But I don't know if that's quite allowed. So I'm still exploring, but that was kind of my idea.
A great idea. Yeah, I would love that to happen.
I am also planning on having a kinder meet and greet one-on-one where they get to come in, especially for the parents, they get to come and see their kid in the classroom, trying to feel like they could feel like part of the community. I think that's our biggest hurdle to overcome, is where our strength is when you step foot onto campus, the parents feel like they're part of the community because we have a small enough field. But we have to be really mindful of our new families not having that experience, and then that keeps them removed, which makes it easy for them to decide to go potentially elsewhere, right? We want it to be an emotional, we want the emotional part to be the reason that they want to stay. So we have to figure out how to pull on their heartstrings a bit.
Julie, I have a question.
Sure, go for it.
We're thinking of doing exactly the same thing, leveraging the cohort of 12 for day camp sports types of activities. Is there somebody there that can provide guidance on that as to where you're crossing over the line? Because there are a lot of games that impart educational information. And if you can divide a kindergarten class into cohorts of 12 and let them do online instruction in the morning and then come to school in the afternoon for sports camp or day camp of some kind, would be nice to know how that would be viewed.
Yeah, and what I'd recommend, because that's a very specific thing, I would recommend posing that question on the telebriefing and asking, because those are the questions that get answered during those. I don't know if you participated in the weekly telebriefings, but we submit questions that are received all the time, and they do address those. So if you could ask that question during that telebriefing, they'll get the direct information from the state, and those answers have been very helpful. Because if it's allowable, or if there's wiggle room, then we can certainly do that. We just need to put the question out there. And again, you have specific things in mind that I think would be helpful to have answered by the county office. Another thought that I heard someone share too was doing class masses for back to school, the grade level masses outside. And so some of the schools are planning on doing that. And we know that's allowable, but again, that question about the day camps, because we know day camps are allowable, I think putting that out there, and I know we already have a couple of questions in to the county for the next telebriefing for that, but tuning into that to really making sure that it's addressed and that you also have it, you can hear it directly, so that way you can say with confidence that it is allowable when you have questions about it.
One of the things that we're working on, and it might not be feasible for everyone depending on your facility and your staff qualifications, but we're looking at pulling our kindergarten into our preschool setting. So then our kindergartners can come to school every day. So that might be something for you to consider as well. If your facility allows it, you just have to reapply for a license and then go through a fire inspection, and then you're good to go. Now then your kindergarten will be pretty much part of your preschool. We're planning the entire year because we don't want to keep going back and forth depending upon what's happening. But of course your teachers have to have those preschool qualifications as well, and you may have to add additional staff depending upon the size of your kindergartens. So that's something we're considering.
Was that addressed in the telebriefing though, that they said that preschools could only function for kids up to age 5, so those kindergartners would have to close? I thought that they talked about that in the telebriefing.
Well, my licensing representative says you can have a license from age 2 through 6. You just have to request a license change depending upon what you currently have. And some of you may already have your license up through age 6. It just depends. I mean, there are a lot of private preschools out there that offer kindergarten programs. So, and then when I spoke with Julie, and she said, if it's a temporary situation, we don't need to change our accreditation to WCEA.
Yeah, we did check with WASC and WCEA on that issue too. So my suggestion would be to talk with Jill, because I know Jill's gone through the appropriate channels, if that's something you're interested in doing. Jill, I hope you don't mind, I just volunteered you, but
that's fine.
Again, I know that's a huge concern, especially for parents with those kindergarten age kids wanting to be on campus. I know Mary Skeen just asked too about delaying the start of the school year, and that is something that schools are doing and some schools are considering at this point. I have seen communications regarding that. I guess just to keep in mind at this point would be the teacher contracts. You know, that's a hard end date, so working within those dates to provide some flexibility. I know that John said that he wanted to continue to explore that idea as well.
When you say explore the idea on teacher contracts, does that mean modifying the contracts to change the dates?
He said he didn't get that specific. John, are you on this call? I'm not sure if he's on anymore. He was on earlier. That is something we're talking about tomorrow, just about the modifying the school year. So I don't know if John's going to take the next step and work with HR. So I'll ask that specific question.
Okay.
But I know that's something that he mentioned yesterday during the call, that that's something that is worth exploring, but we have to figure out what that means logistically in terms of contract dates.
And my recommendation too around that is, as far as moving start of school dates, like it's not necessarily a terrible thing if you feel like you need more time to prepare your community, but we don't know how long we'll be in distance. I mean, like we could be in this through November, like we can't wait till November to start our school years. So, you know, we need to build the system, you know, use some of these best practices that the group has put together so that we can have a program that's going to be really meaningful and powerful for our students and for our families from day one. If you need an extra week to prepare yourself for that, that's fine, but I would caution against waiting to get to open in person.
Can I respond to that, Julie, since I asked the question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the goal would not be to delay in hopes of reopening on site. It would be to prepare teachers, and also with that transition of distributing materials, being able to have masses and introduce the students to the teachers and have some community building at the beginning of the year.
And that makes sense. And I know some, like I said, I know some schools are already planning on that, and for different reasons. So your reason would be community building. I know another school has said, you know, a hard start date by September 8th, regardless, but they're hoping that, you know, the school will come off, that our county will come off of the watch list by that point. So depending on what your reason is, depending on, you know, are you going to have, you have to have a hard start date in mind to be prepared to go with. But I think that's smart also to make sure that your teachers have enough time to prepare, but also taking into mind taking into account your community's needs. So thank you, Mary, for bringing that up.
Just one more question, Julie. What about instructional days? Will that mean that we need to change other days that were considered holidays as instructional days?
Well, currently under AB 77, the instructional days are still, we don't want to dip below 175. So just keep that in mind as you're doing your calendar, that we still want to aim for 175 instructional days at a minimum. Mary, are you talking? Let's see. Okay, any other questions?
Just wanted to say thank you, Julie.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Sorry, I wasn't sure. I was just seeing a blank screen. I think somebody actually has their hand up. Renee, did you have a question?
No, I was just commenting on how helpful this has been. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. You're welcome. It's been a team effort. All right. So if there aren't any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. Hopefully that this was, like I said, hopefully this was helpful to you, as we know that we're most likely looking at distance learning to begin the school year. We'll continue to build out resources, but our suggestion would be, again, we have those due next, and they're in an order which we think makes sense, because you'll need more time, of course, for teachers to unit plan and lesson plan, so that's a bit earlier than some of the other things. But some of those due next can also be happening simultaneously. So we'd ask you to take a look with your leadership team to see what's manageable to start thinking about right now, and what can maybe wait till schools, you know, till teachers are back on contract and on site, and then prioritize it in a way that makes sense to you. So please feel free to reach out with any questions, with any comments, and especially with any resources that you're willing to share with us so we can share them with your colleagues. So thank you all, and thank you especially to the Instructional Programs Working Group team. It's been awesome working together, and we'll talk soon and reach out with any questions or comments. Thank you.
Julie, it's Mary again. Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Under what circumstances was a school trying to determine a hard start date after on September 8th?
They were just in the communication I saw, and I would share it with you, but I haven't asked that principal. But in the communication, it was they were hoping that we would be off of the watch list.
Okay.
You know, by a point. So that was more of a hoping to get off the watch list and then have that live in person time. But again, I'm sure there were some other considerations as well. But
okay,
I know it's a tough decision at this time.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is one more question?
Sure, sure. No, I'm hanging on in case there are any questions.
Is that something you're going to allow each school site to determine?
That's something we're talking with our team tomorrow. We have a team meeting tomorrow, but that's something that we don't see any issues with as long as, again, it's the teacher contract and also maintaining that minimum number of instructional days.
Okay.
So if you can work within that and make it work, there's no reason why your start date couldn't be flexible according to what your needs are.
Okay. Thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Julie, and then we can talk about this. I have a couple things. We can talk about it maybe at CLT, but that instructional minute document is really important, and I think it might be buried. And so I'm wondering if it needs to be in isolation in an admin newsletter or something, because that's, you know, we had 39 people here, but that's contingent upon the principal being here and then also knowing how to re-access that. Just a thought. I don't know what you're thinking, but I think
that makes sense.
That's
And
a logistical piece.
Right.
So,
and on the website, I thought we could feature that as well. So working on that this weekend.
I figured that as well. And then I think we're going to need to provide more info on it and support on attendance.
Okay.
And then another thing I was thinking as we were talking, now that, you know, initially we were kind of in our head, at least I was in my head thinking we were going to start